So, let's begin. Everybody ready? Everybody ready? Let's go. Alright. We are almost 1600. We're moving right along. And 1620, low Zacks. Okay, let's go e4. Let's go with a Vienna Gambit, maybe. What should we play? I don't know what to play. Rai Lopez, Italian, Scotch. Okay, let's play a Vienna Gambit. Let's play a Vienna Gambit. Let's go knight c3. Let's play a Vienna Gambit. And f4. Let's play a Vienna Gambit. Because most people, okay, d6. Now, this is a very common move at this level. It's not terrible, but it's very passive. It's very passive. It's a typical way of declining the gambit. It blocks in the bishop, and it essentially gives us all that we want. Now, in the Vienna, your goal is for black to take the pawn. What does it do? Why are we sacrificing the pawn? Well, there are two main reasons. The first is that we, of course, get a bigger control of the center with d4. The second is that we open up the f-file. And as I've often stated, opening up the f-file is a double-sided sword. On the one hand, it can be good for black because, well, it's a weakness, particularly if white castle's short. But it can also be a great strength because white's rook on f1 will have essentially a wide open avenue to attacking black's pawn on f7, if that makes sense. So how should we play here? Well, there's nothing particularly special that we should do. We should just develop our pieces and try to get black to take the pawn. Yeah, with Vienna, you play knight c3 first. I'll talk about that a little bit after the game. Okay, knight c6. And now we have two choices for where to develop this bishop. We can develop it to c4, but we can also play the sort of Rai Lopez style and develop it to b5. And the plus of developing it to b5 is that we put immediate pressure on the pawn on e5. I've analyzed this a little bit because I have some students who play the Vienna, and bishop b5 is the best move, I think. Bishop b5. This is like a Rai Lopez on steroids, though. Bishop d7. All right. Now, what should we do? This is a bit of a trick question because I think I know what some of you will come up with. What do you think we should do? Yeah. So, Diese, you fell into my trap. Now, some of you may think, let me take the knight and then take the pawn and win a pawn. But you need to see the bigger picture here, which is that white isn't very well developed yet. And going after the pawn, not only does it not win a pawn because black will be able to capture on e4, I'll show this after the game, but those transformations are favorable for black because we've made a weakness on the king side. And so the point of the Vienna isn't to go pawn hunting, it's to develop your pieces and go for an attack. Now I would consider this a little bit more carefully, but it still doesn't work. It still doesn't work. Who can tell me why? If we take on c6 and then we take twice on e5, what move is black going to have at the end of the line? Which shows the fact that the f-file being open is double-sided. You know. Not bishop takes e4. Bishop takes e4 is not dangerous, but queen d4 check forks the knight and the king. So instead of this, we should move our bishop. Where should we move it? We can move it either to c4 or to a4. I feel like now that we've castled, bishop c4 makes more sense. Maybe a sacrifice on f7 is on the cards. Let's go bishop c4. If he doesn't do anything to castle, if he doesn't go here, okay, he goes bishop e6. That's not a terrible move. Now, what options do we have? We can either trade bishops. That's probably what we're going to end up doing because that weakens his center and his king side. Or if we wanted to trade on our own terms, if we wanted to make a mature move, how could we trade on our own terms? What's the common move in such positions? It's not d3, it's bishop b3. Bishop b3 stepping back. You see this in the London, you see this in a lot of different openings. I call it trading on your own terms, where you get black to take your bishop, you take with the a pawn, and it's a much more favorable transformation than, for example, playing d3. But I like the concept of taking the bishop because we weaken his position. Nothing wrong with that at all. Simple chess. Now, again, we can play more positionally, we can play more tactically. The positional move is to take on e5. We can take on e5 and just say, okay, you're going to have doubled pawns, you're going to have weak pawns in the center, and then we can play d3 and bishop g5, and we have a slight advantage. But we can also play this very aggressively, very tactically. And how should we play it tactically if we wanted to? Well, He has an e-pawn that's now a weakness. We need to consider that. Can we attack it? Let's go ahead and do it. Knight g5. Probably not what I would have played in one of my own games, but it is in the spirit of the Vienna. Yeah, d3 is fine too. d3 is a more positional move, but I want to act with a sense of urgency here. All right. Now we have a really cool idea, which, let me calculate. One moment, I'm just trying to figure it out whether it works. It's, believe it or not, it's very complex. There's an idea that is very interesting, but it involves a certain degree of risk. But let's do it. Now it's, yeah, so you guys are, many of you are saying f takes e5. And if he takes with a knight, then he walks right into d4. If he takes with a pawn, many of you are noticing the possibility of bringing the queen out to h5. But of course, that's not possible when he has a knight on f6. So, as I'll show after the game, we could have sacrificed our exchange. Here, doing the same thing isn't effective because that knight could step back to g6 and block the check. So here, of course, we should just play d4. With tempo, this is a phenomenal position for us. Knight g6. So what should we do now? How should we transform our clear initiative into a concrete advantage? Now, what we need to realize here is that when you've got a center like this, when you've got an attack on the pawn, you just need, the move, I think, flows naturally from the position. There's two pawn breaks that need to be considered. There's e5 and d5. If you look at e5 carefully, you'll see that after d takes e5, that just gives a pawn up. I don't see a follow-up there, and that allows a queen trade, which is not in our favor. But the move d5 is very good because it establishes a stronghold for the knight on e6. That's a more positional move than anything, but that outpost on e6 is going to be completely deadly. Very natural play. After he goes e5. Our move is very obvious. Now we go knight e6. Look at this beautiful outpost. He can't even castle. He can barely move. This knight paralyzes his entire position. And it's supported by a pawn chain. So even if he goes c6, we don't need to do anything about that because our pawn will not be at risk of being undermined. Yeah, so as Gaines is indicating, bishop g5 is probably going to be our follow-up. Hitting the knight on f6, his position is on the verge of collapse. If he goes bishop e7, he drops the pawn. There comes c6. There comes c6. We don't need to do anything about it. He's not really threatening to take. That will soften up our knight outpost, but it won't necessarily, it won't do anything specific. By the time he gets around to challenging this knight, he's going to be checkmated. Bishop g5, it is. Now, in such situations, the very best players, when you get into a situation, you can feel that the win is nearby. You don't want to rush a single move because you never know when there might be a hidden tactic or a way to improve on the obvious move. So e takes d5 is the obvious move, and it's perfectly good enough. Is there a better move? Is there any way to win the game even faster? There is. If you take on f6, he can take the other knight, but the best move is knight takes d5. He takes on e6, not hard to establish that we fork the queen and the king, which is what's going to happen, and I'll show what would have happened. Yeah, he resigns. If he would have taken our knight, then in contrast with the immediate e takes d5, in contrast with this, the f file is open. The f file being open is obviously in our favor. He's totally paralyzed. We have a very simple plan of victory. We can go queen h5 or queen f3. I mean, there's just anything would win here. He can resign. All right. So that was a nice game. And the Vienna is one of the best openings, bar none, for players of this level, 1600, 1700. So the bottom line in the Vienna is that e takes f4 is a big mistake. A lot of people take the pawn thinking that this is a king's gambit. But the difference between the king's gambit and the Vienna is revealed in the fact that the knights are developed, which is in white's favor, because the move e5 becomes possible, chasing away the knight. In fact, the knight has nowhere to go. It has to go back to g8, which is a huge, undevelop your pieces like this. It's not good. You go knight f3, don't go d4. Don't allow this nasty check on h4. So you go knight f3, then d4. You've got a big lead in development. You're probably going to win this pawn back. I've got a couple of students who play this. Black is in massive trouble here. Now there's a couple of beautiful lines that stem from this position. One is, well, black often plays d6, right? And you play d4 to support the pawn. After d takes c5, I've analyzed this very deeply with a computer. And it may appear that white is in a little bit of trouble here, because if you take with the knight, what move is possible? I just want to hammer this into people's heads. This is a big no-no in such positions, because it allows queen h4 check. Why is this a problem? Because you have to move your king. If you go g3, then there's f takes g3. The pawn on f4 is a very nasty one. But if you play de, then you allow the queen trade, and you certainly don't want to allow the queen trade. The whole point of a development advantage is to, well, you don't want the queen trade. So you give a check on b5, you develop a tempo. But black simply has the move c6, so what are we doing here? But the funny thing is, you just play bishop c4. You have 3 pieces developed, black has none. And you don't give a damn about any of the pawns. E takes d4. And at this point, wait, just let me remember. Yeah, at this point, you play bishop takes f4. That's the idea. Okay, now you're currently 2 pawns down. Currently 2 pawns down. What do you have in return for them? You've developed all 4 pieces and black's developed nothing? Now what are we doing here? Why are we giving away the knight? What's the idea? What's the idea here? And this is an idea which we've had on the speedrun many times. The king in contact with the queen. Boom, goes the dynamite. But it's not over yet. Black has the move king e7. He doesn't have to take the bishop and drop the queen. Now we sacrifice another piece. We give a check on e2. This forces the king to take the bishop. But now the king is literally toast. And there's one really funny line. You have several ways to win the game. Several ways to win the game. Let me remember what the best line is. I'm trying to remember. Yeah. So the best move here is knight to e5 check, centralizing the knight. If the king goes back to e8, then it walks right into a discovered check, which wins the queen. Right, this is a typical discovered check, wins the queen. Black will have some pieces for the queen, but because black's king is so exposed, he's still losing. So the king can go to e6, and you still have a discovery. All right, so king f6 seems to be the only way to avoid losing a queen immediately. But what tactic does white have in this position? And this is another very common pattern. Bishop g5 distracting, knight f7 check, winning the queen. But you don't even take the queen yet. If black goes king f6, white has a really sexy move. Really sexy move. You don't have to take the queen yet. What is that sexy move? This move will get you way too many dates. Castle will check defend the knight. Black has to block it with bishop f5. Rook takes f5. This all plays itself. Rook f1, king g6, and checkmate is at hand after queen g4. Yeah, this is mate. That's a really sick line. So black is forced to go king g6. And now comes an even cooler. To me, this is even cooler. Now you can take the queen. That seems very natural, and that is winning. But it's not winning as obviously as people may think, because remember, black has 3 pieces for the queen. And if black brings all of his pieces out, the king may become relatively safe. So instead of taking the queen, what else can white do here? This move looks really bad. You can take the rook. Now, it looks bad because why would you take the rook when you can take the queen? But the point is that the king has nowhere to go. If it goes to h6 or g5, you simply return to f7 and win the queen. If it goes to f6, we already know how white wins. White castles, bishop f5 is forced. King has no other squares. The fact that the queen cuts the king off is what kills black. And then you basically do the same thing. It's a slightly different checkmate. After king g5, you do basically transpose into the main line, queen g4 with checkmate. You don't even have to take the queen. It's, yeah. This is what I analyzed. So this is really amazing. Now, this is unlikely to happen in all of your games, but it's just one example of how tactical the Vienna can get and the consequences you suffer if you're behind in development. You're welcome. So I hope everybody followed more or less the lines, which this is why he takes f4 as a mistake. The best move is d5. The best move is d5. And that counter strikes in the center. It's a pretty logical move, right? You meet a move on the flank with a move in the center. And this is the theoretical position where queen f3 has recently become the best move. This is super interesting. I think Levy's made a course on this. I don't want to get into the details, but it's quite dangerous. It's quite a dangerous line for black. So black, I've even faced it myself, and I've lost a couple of games here with black. I highly recommend the Vienna for people who want this kind of stuff. Okay, so there is no really good way, and technically this declines the gambit. Technically this is a counter gambit almost, but material is equal. So d6 is not terrible, but it's the precursor to playing very passively. So knight c6 is fine, bishop b5. This is all okay for him, but I think he has to develop very quickly. He's got to go bishop e7 and castle. Clearly black is worse here from a just positional perspective, but black's position is very solid here. There's nothing terribly wrong with playing this. All right, and how should white play here? White has a couple of ways of going about this. Maybe it's time to take on e5. Another good move is to tuck the king on h1 so that these queen d4 check ideas, I'm sure you've seen this move played in many types of positions. It's kind of the same as going king b1 when you're castling long. The Vienna is not no. Vienna is played by many grandmasters. It's not unsound at all. I mean, black can equalize on the main line, but white is not worse. White is not worse in the main line, even if black plays everything correctly. What are the reasons white is clearly better positionally? Well, if you can compare the development, right? Look at how passive black's bishops are. White's light squared bishop is developed to a good square. Knights are developed to good squares. White's got more central control than black. White's got these two pawns. White can bring a third pawn up. It's just even visually, it has to do with the fact that black is very passive. Black's pieces don't have a lot of potential energy, and white's pieces have a lot. All right. So he plays a6. We play bishop c4. Again, why didn't we take on c6? Takes, f takes, d takes, knight takes. Now, this is a very bad move because we've castled, black hasn't castled. It should be clear to you guys that black is going to get killed here. I mean, knight takes f7 for one thing. Looks pretty good, and despite this check, I think black is on the cusp of being losing. Another little side note, there is no smothered mate when you've got a rook on f1. This is a very good way to defend against smothered mate because you can always sack the exchange in this position. You're not actually sacking the exchange here because black's rook is also hanging, but that's the bottom line. And but all of that is a moot point because queen d4 check wins the knight. So that's a pretty big, pretty typical kind of blunder when you open the f file. All right, bishop c4. Well, JDD, it's played by GMs. It's played by GMs, but yeah, at the highest level, everybody knows how to equalize. It's not particularly testing at the highest level because everybody knows how to equalize. But again, white is not worse. Okay, so bishop e6. We decided to take the bishop. I still think he should have gone bishop e7 and castled. It wouldn't have been too late, although now black is quite a bit worse. So bishop c4, bishop e6, captures. And again, the positional approach would be to simply take and say, yeah, you've got these doubled pawns. They're also isolated. So we just go d3, bishop c5, king h1. But this is a little boring. White is better. Undoubtedly, white is better. Then you have a plan, for example, of getting your queen to g3. But we decided to play a little bit more adventurously, knight to g5. Now, I think that black had a better way, perhaps, of defending this pawn. There was knight to d4, which would have been quite interesting. But our opponent played queen d7. We go f takes c5. And at this point, knight takes c5 is, I would say, a decisive mistake. Because allowing this move to be played with tempo is totally disastrous. Totally disastrous. But after d takes c5, I was calculating a very cool continuation. Rook takes f6. Now the idea is to remove the defender from the h5 square. This line is very simple to calculate. If king to d8, you give a fork and you win the rook. If king to e7, who can spot the winning continuation? And it's not just the first move. You need to play the first move correctly, and the second move is very important, not to fall for the temptation. Look carefully, guys. Everybody should be able to see this move. Queen f7, but this is the tricky moment. A lot of you guys are falling for the temptation to take. I know it. Don't make any assumptions about what the correct move looks like. King c8, and black is out of the woods. The knight check looks fancy, but it doesn't do anything. The move you have to play is this check, queen f6. This does something. This forks the rook and the king, and white wins the rook, and white's up a piece. All right, queen takes f6, very important. The move doesn't always look good, but this is the move which accomplishes the most. But what was I calculating? What did I spend time calculating? This took me a couple of seconds. What about king d6? Ooh, you're right. Yeah, I mean, king d6 is possible, But after queen takes f6 anyway, there's going to be too many threats. You're right, that should be considered, but knight f7 is going to come and the king's going to get hunted down. All right. Oh my goodness, there's a cool line there. Yeah, I missed king d6, but I think white is winning here anyway. But great job indicating this. You know what would be a nice move is b3 could be cool too. Preparing bishop a3. And black can't really take because of the fork. That's kind of cool. Anyways, so what was I looking at? What was I looking at? What was I worried about? Again, when you play the Vienna, you always have to watch for stuff happening on this diagonal, because that's the price you pay to get such a tactical position. Bishop c5 check is an intermediate move which can be potentially very, very nasty. Well, queen d4 doesn't do much. Queen d4 you can play rook f2. Queen d4 you can play rook f2 and you're fine. But you can even go king h1. And I don't think this is any weaker because the queen is now away from d7. But rook f2 check just keeps the extra piece. And after bishop c5, white has to be a little bit careful, but I don't think white's in any trouble. For one thing, you could play the move queen to f3. And if you count up the material, after black takes everything, white's got 2 pieces for a rook. White's much, much better here. That's a pretty significant material plus. But black can play bishop c5 first, and if king h1, then g takes f6. And if queen h5, the king now has this little square on f8 where it can go to, and it seems to be relatively safe. But there is the move in this position, rook f2 anyway, and that's a hard move to spot. It looks very scary, right? You have to get your king to f2, but I couldn't find any good follow-up for black. If rook f8 check, black could even castle with check. Just drop your knight back to f3. If queen d4 check, the king can migrate to g3, which I think is a very safe square. There's just no stuff on the king side that black could use to attack the king. As soon as white plays d3 and gets the bishop out, this is called consolidating, white's going to be totally fine. 2 pieces for a rook, white's better. All right? But in such situations, you got to look for the intermediate move. It's always easy for me to say, but practice telling yourself that and you're going to see more of these kinds of moves. Just like in the Bach knight. After knight takes e5, d4, knight g6, and now d5. d5, securing the e6 square for the knight. This is game over. e5, knight e6. Yeah, this is totally crushing. He's got no moves. If he moves the bishop out, then knight takes g7. But the way it happened, yeah, this and a fork. Just last thing. After king f7, knight e6, king e6, who can spot the fastest way to win the game? What's the fastest way to follow up from here and force just a complete catastrophe? Boom. Boom. Simple clearance of the defender, or removal of the defender. Check. Check. And win the rook. Yeah. And the game is over, red or over, as Mr. Wrench says. Okay. Any questions? Who invented the Vienna? Vladimir Vienna. What's the meaning of life? There we go. In the main line, Vienna with queen f6. Yeah, knight c6 is the main line. Yeah, the beginning of the Vienna, e4, e5, knight c3. So in contrast to the King's Gambit, where you play f4 immediately, you go knight c3. Don't go knight f3. That blocks the f pawn. Knight f6 and then f4.